1939. The Soviet Union was a massive communist empire, stretching from the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, with an enormous army numbering 5 million men. For comparison, the entire population of Finland at the time was only about 3.5 million. The Soviet Union possessed vast numbers of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Its leadership constantly declared that this enormous army existed purely for defensive purposes, but the Soviet Union was far from harmless. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing, watching its neighbors and deciding who might become lunch and who might be dinner. Meanwhile, in the West, another wolf was already on the prowl. Nazi Germany. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union signed an agreement with Germany that would go down in history as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Under this agreement, the Soviets and the Germans divided the map of Europe into spheres of influence. Soon after, in the fall of 1939, Poland was torn apart, and the Soviet Union received a significant portion of its territory. And then, the next choice fell on a small, neutral country, Finland. It's important to remember that Finland had already once been occupied by the Russian Empire, from 1809 to 1917. After 108 years of occupation, the Finns finally broke free and gained their independence. The Soviet leadership decided that this so-called historical mistake needed to be corrected. They could have simply invaded Finland outright and taken it by force, but that would have looked inelegant in the eyes of the world. So they needed a reason, and the Soviet leaders created one. Finland was presented with an ultimatum demanding that it surrender part of its territory. In exchange, it was offered land that was largely barren and unsuitable for settlement. The justification was that the Finnish border lay dangerously close to Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. Unsurprisingly, the Finnish government refused. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was preparing for invasion. They developed a plan coordinated with Finnish communists and formed a new government that would be loyal to Moscow. The existing Finnish government was declared illegitimate. A clever move, at the head of this puppet government stood the collaborator Otto Kuusinen. On November 26, 1939, artillery fire struck the village of Manila, where Soviet troops were stationed. It was a provocation orchestrated by the Soviets, used as justification to launch the invasion of Finland. History remembers this as the Manila incident. There was nothing particularly new about this tactic. The Soviet Union had effectively copied it from Nazi Germany, which had used a similar provocation just 3 months earlier against Poland. 4 days after the provocation, on November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland without declaring war. The Soviets even used a mocking slogan: "We will help the friendly people of Finland free themselves from their cursed capitalists." Amusing, isn't it? For the invasion, nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers were deployed against roughly 250,000 Finnish troops, 3,000 tanks against just 30, 3,000 artillery pieces and mortars against 500, and 3,800 aircraft against only 130 Finnish planes. Stalin and his generals anticipated a swift victory. Within 2 weeks, Soviet tanks were expected to roll into Helsinki. The confidence in the Kremlin ran so high that medals and decorations had already been mass-produced in anticipation of victory. Preparations were underway for celebrations, ceremonies, and awards. But the Finnish people had their own plan for this war. Civilians were evacuated from the border regions before the enemy arrived. As they retreated, the Finns heavily mined the terrain. Finnish commanders understood that large-scale battles would not favor them, so instead they adopted a different approach, attacking in small, mobile groups. It became known as the Motti tactic. The Soviets had tanks, trucks, and aircraft. The Finns had their own advanced technology. Skis. Yes, skis. 2 flat wooden boards and 2 poles. Nothing secret, nothing sophisticated. But to understand why that mattered, you have to understand the Finnish people. This was a tough, resilient nation raised in brutal conditions. Winter in Finland runs from October to May. Temperatures regularly drop below minus 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes even below 40. Finnish children grew up on skis. Many of the men were skilled hunters. In winter, they hunted valuable fur-bearing animals, and to preserve the fur, you couldn't just shoot anywhere. You had to hit the animal in the eye. That was their standard of accuracy. When war came, many of those hunters became snipers. They were true super soldiers. They could lie motionless in the snow for hours, waiting. They even ate snow so that no steam would rise from their breath. It's almost impossible to imagine. Finnish snipers followed a simple but ruthless rule. First, eliminate the officers, and the foolishness of the Soviet command made that task even easier. Officers were issued distinctive sheepskin coats, making them stand out in the snow. They were perfect targets. Meanwhile, Finnish soldiers wore white camouflage over their uniforms, blending almost completely into the landscape. After taking their shots, they vanished, fast and silent, back into the forest. A small ski unit could destroy an entire column, dozens of vehicles, hundreds of soldiers, without officers, without communication, with frozen or disabled equipment. The survivors often didn't die in battle. They froze in the Finnish wilderness. Finnish snipers played a decisive role in breaking the Soviet advance. Among them was the legendary Simo Häyhä, known as the White Death. Depending on the source, he killed either 505 or 542 Red Army soldiers in just 3 months of war. He did all of it with an ordinary rifle using iron sights. That record still stands. Finnish ski units also carried mortars on their backs, setting up ambushes in the forests and shelling Soviet troops from hidden positions. They even had a clever way of moving quickly across roads or open terrain. Up to 10 skiers would tie themselves by rope to a single horse and be pulled at high speed across the snow. Reindeer were also widely used to transport ammunition and even artillery. For a relatively small war, this conflict introduced a surprising number of innovations. Take, for example, the famous Molotov cocktail, simple bottles filled with flammable liquid. The Finns gave it that name as a joke. Whenever Soviet tanks went up in flames, they would shout, "A gift for Molotov." At the time, Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister and one of the chief propagandists of the war. Molotov cocktails are still used in conflicts around the world to this day. During the Winter War alone, the Finns produced more than 500,000 of them. Finnish forces also used the so-called Motti tactic. The first and last vehicles in a Soviet column would be disabled by mines or machine gun fire. Snipers would then eliminate officers, radio operators, and drivers. After that, the remaining soldiers were either finished off or simply left behind, and the cold would finish the rest. We should also remember the Mannerheim Line, a defensive fortification system on the Karelian Isthmus stretching 136 kilometers. It consisted of concrete bunkers and fortified firing positions. It was named after the commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, Gustaf Mannerheim. The Finns had begun constructing the line as early as 1924. Even then, they were expecting trouble from their dangerous neighbor. Construction continued right up until the war. Unfortunately, due to limited resources, the line was not deeply fortified. In reality, it was more like a chain of bunkers and pillboxes arranged in a single defensive belt. Nevertheless, along the Mannerheim Line, the Finns managed to hold back the main Soviet assault for more than 2 months. Nature itself seemed to side with the defenders. Brutal cold set in, temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Fuel froze in the tanks. Oil thickened inside the engines. Batteries died. Vehicles simply refused to start. The machines that had rolled so proudly across Red Square during parades proved useless in the harsh reality of the Winter War. At the beginning of the war, the Finnish army faced a serious problem: a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. The Finns solved it in a remarkably simple way. They took weapons from the enemy. In the first month alone, they captured more than 40 tanks, over 100 artillery pieces, 350 machine guns, several thousand rifles, and large quantities of ammunition. Then help began to arrive. Starting in December, Britain and France supplied Finland with weapons. At the same time, around 10,000 volunteers from Norway and Sweden joined the Finnish army. Meanwhile, Soviet generals turned to what generals often do when victory proves elusive on the battlefield. They began targeting civilian populations. Bombing of Helsinki and other cities intensified, leading to heavy civilian casualties. The Finnish army continued to defend with determination and skill, inflicting heavy losses. But Finland faced one overwhelming problem: manpower. Even though Finnish forces often achieved casualty ratios of 1 to 10 or more, there was a harsh reality behind those numbers. Each fallen Finnish soldier was almost impossible to replace. For every 10 Red Army soldiers killed, 10 more would arrive to take their place. That was the arithmetic of war. In military terms, those are called irreplaceable losses. Unlike Finland, the Soviet Union possessed what seemed like an almost limitless supply of manpower. For every 100,000 wounded or killed, another 100,000 soldiers took their place. After weeks of brutal and exhausting fighting, on February 15th, 1940, the Mannerheim Line was finally breached, and the Finnish army was forced to retreat. But the defense did not collapse. It continued. Eventually, under mounting pressure, after intense discussions and difficult deliberations, the Finnish government made a painful decision and requested an armistice. Despite its overwhelming superiority, the Soviet Union agreed almost immediately. Because even with vast resources, Moscow could no longer afford to keep spending them in a war against a small country like Finland. There was also a serious risk that Britain and France might fully enter the war on Finland's side, and that was not part of Moscow's plans. As a result of negotiations, on March 13th, 1940, the Soviet-Finnish peace treaty was signed. An interesting detail, even after the peace agreement was concluded, parts of the Finnish army were reluctant to comply. They continued to hold Finland's second largest city, Viipuri. That speaks volumes about the spirit of Finnish soldiers. When Soviet forces failed to take the city by direct assault, they unleashed massive artillery fire from every available gun. In the end, the Finns withdrew, and Soviet troops entered a completely shattered Viipuri. All that remained were ruins. So what were the results of this war? On paper, Finland lost. It gave up roughly 10% of its territory. Around 500,000 Finnish civilians, unwilling to live under Soviet occupation, abandoned their homes and resettled deeper inside the country. But the most important outcome was this: Finland preserved its independence. In time, it became a prosperous, developed nation. The country it remains today, with its own language, culture, identity, and freedom. For the Soviets, it was a Pyrrhic victory. A win that came at a devastating cost. The territory they gained was relatively small compared to the scale of the Soviet Union itself, yet the cost was staggering. More than 400,000 killed and wounded. Unofficial estimates pushed that number closer to 700,000. More importantly, the world saw something new. The Soviet Union was revealed as a so-called giant with feet of clay. It was not invincible. And somewhere else in Europe, another wolf bearing a swastika was watching carefully and drawing conclusions. Just 1 year and 3 months later, on June 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. But that is another story.